Okay, so let's have a look at these transpiration questions. So the first one says, water is transported in transpiration. What else may be transported in this way? So we know that's going to be mineral ions because they are absorbed or dissolved inside the water. The second question, which cells are used to carry water in the stem of the plant? That's going to be the xylem vessels, and we know that those cells are dead. Okay, the next question says, transpiration relies on the evaporation of water from the leaves. What process drives transpiration? Well, it is the evaporation, because once the water has evaporated from the leaves out through the stomata, then we're going to have osmosis, which then moves that water from cell to cell to cell, up the xylem, and then in through the root hairs. One of the functions of xylem is to support the plant. List the two substances found in xylem cell walls that helps the cells carry out this function. So cell walls, we already know, are made of cellulose. So all plant cell walls are made of cellulose, but xylem vessels also have this extra substance called lignin around the outside of their cells. So a student carries out an experiment using the potometer shown and an electric fan which is set at different powers. The results are shown in the table. So here's our potometer. So we've got our plant here which is connected to capillary tubing. So the capillary tubing is basically just an extension of the xylem vessels. You've got to pretend that here normally this would be the xylem vessel. We've got a reservoir here with a tap so that we can refill this with water. And then we've got an air bubble here, and as the plant is losing water vapour through its leaves, that water will move up the tubing, up into the xylem, and so we will have an air bubble pulled along the capillary tubing, and we can look at how far that air bubble is moving in a certain length of time. So here we've got our results. So we've had a fan blowing onto the leaves. So we've got 10 watts, 15 watts, 20 watts and 25 watts. That's different power ratings. So the 25 is obviously going to be the biggest power rating. And the distance moved by the bubble in 5 minutes is shown. And this person has repeated their experiment 3 times. So the first thing we need to do is we need to calculate means for each one of these. So to calculate a mean, remember, we would have each value, 22 plus 27 plus 26, divided by how many there are, which is 3, and that would give us a value of 25. And if we work those out, 35 plus 36 plus 34 divided by 3, that gives us a value of 35. 42 plus 44 plus 49 divided by 3 gives a value of 45. And then 55 plus 57 plus 56 divided by 3 gives us a value of 55. So that is the distance that the bubble moved in 5 minutes, so the mean distance that it travelled. So we've calculated our mean values. So now it says calculate the mean rate of transpiration for each power setting. This is the volume of water lost per minute. Now here, this was the distance that the bubble travelled in 5 minutes, so we now need to work it out per minute. So what we're going to do is divide each one of these values by 5. So in a minute, this one would have travelled 5 millimetres. 35 divided by 5 gives us 7. 45 divided by 5 is 9. And 55 divided by 5 is 11. So that tells us that on a power rating of 10, our bubble moved 5 millimetres in 1 minute, 25 millimetres on average in 5 minutes. Okay, so that's how we calculate that column. Right, part C, it now says the volume of a cylinder is calculated using this equation. So I'm going to draw myself a cylinder just to remind myself. And where V is the volume, there's our V, pi, 3.142, but obviously you hopefully should have a pi button on your calculator. R is the radius, and so that's r squared, and the height would be the length in this case of our tubing. So the question says, use the equation to calculate the rates of transpiration in units of millimetre cubed of water per minute. The diameter of the potometer tube is 1.3 millimetres. So if we look here, here's our cylinder, and that's basically replicating a small part of the tubing. So we're looking at the distance that the tubing travels, of the bubble travels, sorry, and that is going to be our height. They've told us that the diameter of our cylinder is 1.3 millimetres. So obviously to calculate our radius is half of the diameter. So half of 1.3 is 0.65. So now let's work out our first one here. So I'm going to just do it on this page here. So the first one, we're calculating the volume. So the volume equals pi r squared h, which is pi times r squared, which you've calculated, 0.65 squared, times by h. And h in our first one, we know that it travelled 5 millimetres in 1 minute. So our h in this instance is 5, and that gives us a value of 6.6. Right, then we need to do that for our next 3. Okay, so for the next 3, we're going to have the volume is pi r squared h. Pi is exactly the same, r squared is exactly the same, so the only thing that's going to change is going to be our height, which for the second one was 7, and that gives us a value of 9.3, and then we can do that again, but this time with a height of 9 and then a height of 11. And if we do that, the values we should get 6.6, 9.3, 11.9 and 14.6. Okay, so then it says explain why increasing the fan power setting increases the rate of transpiration. Well, let's just check our results to show that. Yeah, if we increase the fan power, our rate of transpiration, millimetres cubed per minute, is increasing. So why is that happening? Okay, so I'm going to just put my answer just down here. So what's happening is that when there is more wind, what we're doing is it blows away the water vapour from outside the leaf. That, so if you think about your stomata, if you've got your leaf here and you've got your guard cells there, there's your epidermis, okay, here's your water vapour inside your leaf, okay, not a very good diagram but it will do, okay, that water vapour is diffusing out through the stomata into the surrounding air, but if we have the wind blowing, the wind is going to blow that water away, and when it does that, what it does is it creates a steeper gradient, and we know that if we have a steeper gradient we have faster diffusion of the water vapour out of the stomata, and so therefore that means that we have greater diffusion, transpiration. Okay, right, let's look at the next question. So now it says explain, it says the drawing shows the cells used for transpiration. Okay, so we know that this is our xylem vessels. Explain how transpiration occurs. Okay, so let's get a piece of paper. So transpiration, the easy thing to do is to start at the bottom and think about water coming in through the roots, but remember when we're talking about transpiration we're always starting at the leaves. Okay, so number 1, so water evaporates from the cells in the leaves into the air spaces. Number 2, the water vapour diffuses out of the leaf via diffusion and through the stomata. Now, I know I've put diffusion twice there, but actually it's really important to recognise that you get marks for saying how the gas is diffused. So this water vapour here, which is now a gas because it's evaporated, diffuses through the stomata. Number 3, so water is drawn up the stem in the xylem vessels to replace the water lost in the leaf. So we've now got that water being pulled up the stem, and then we now have water enters the root hair cells, and we've got to make sure that we'll always say root hair cells, from the soil and moves into the xylem. Okay, and it does that to replace the water that's moved up to the stem. Now we could add a little bit extra here because we know there are 2 different ways that water can move into those root hair cells, and so if we're looking for a grade 9 it's good to include those. We could say that it moves into the root hair cells by, number 1 would be osmosis, and then it goes into the cytoplasm, or we could have that it moves into, by diffusion, into the cell walls. Okay. Right, next question. State the name of these cells. We know that already. They are xylem vessels. And then lastly, explain one way in which these cells are adapted for transpiration. Okay, so we've got several ways that we could write down. Let's think about those. So number 1 is that these cells are dead and they have no cytoplasm, and that means that there's more room for water. Number 2, they have lignin, which means that they have tough walls to withstand the water pressure. And the other thing that we could say is that those cells, remember, there are no ends to the cells, so water can flow freely.